Operation Downfal was never executed. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. But the Pacific was different. Japan had not collapsed. Despite catastrophic losses at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, despite relentless naval blockades and firebombing raids that reduced entire cities to ash, Tokyo refused surrender. American planners understood something the public did not. The final battle would not be at sea. It would be fought on Japan's home soil, and it would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Okinawa was the warning. More than 12,000 Americans were killed, tens of thousands wounded. Japanese casualties are far higher. Civilians caught between armies, and that was a small island 350 miles from Kyushu. If Okinawa was a preview, the invasion of Japan would be an apocalypse. Yet there was no alternative on the table. In early 1945, the United States had already committed to total victory. The policy of unconditional surrender, declared earlier in the war, left no room for negotiated peace. Japan had to be forced to yield. The code name was simple: Operation Downfal. It was divided into two massive phases. First, Operation Olympic, the invasion of southern Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945. Second, Operation Coronet, the assault on the Kano Plain near Tokyo, planned for spring 1946. Together, they would involve millions of troops, thousands of ships, and air superiority on an unprecedented scale. To put it into perspective, D-Day in Normandy deployed roughly 156,000 troops on the first day. Operation Olympic alone planned for more than twice that number in its opening wave, and that was just Phase 1. American planners believed Japan was weakened, industry crippled, navy shattered, the air force degraded. But intelligence began to reveal something unsettling. Japan was not preparing to surrender. It was preparing to bleed the invaders dry. Tokyo had shifted its strategy from a decisive naval battle to national resistance. Every beach, every hill, every civilian potentially mobilized. The Japanese called it Ketsgo, the decisive homeland defense. And Kyushu would be the killing ground. Kyushu was not random. It offered airfields close enough to support the later assault on Tokyo. It had beaches suitable for landing craft. It provided a staging ground for the final blow. But it also gave the defenders advantages: mountainous terrain, limited landing zones, natural choke points. American troops would be funneled into predictable corridors. Japanese planners understood this. They concentrated troops, artillery, and hidden fortifications exactly where the landings were expected. By mid-1945, estimates of Japanese defenders on Kyushu had risen dramatically, far beyond early Allied assumptions. What was supposed to be a weakened garrison was turning into a fortified trap. Casualty projections varied. Some estimates predicted 250,000 American casualties across both phases. Others projected far more. Millions of Japanese military and civilian deaths were possible. And those numbers were not hypothetical. They were drawn from Okinawa's brutal precedent. If civilians on Okinawa had resisted with bamboo spears and suicide charges, what would happen on the main islands? The invasion was no longer just a military problem. It was a demographic catastrophe waiting to unfold. By July 1945, the United States faced a narrowing set of options: continue blockade and bombing, hoping starvation forces surrender, launch Operation Downfal and accept enormous casualties, introduce something new, something decisive. At this moment, another project, developed in secrecy for years, was reaching completion. But in July, planners still assumed Downfal would proceed. Ships were assembling. Divisions were training. Maps were being marked in red grease pencil. The largest invasion fleet in history was forming in the Pacific. And yet, behind closed doors, intelligence updates were growing darker. Japanese troop numbers were rising, not falling. Kamikaze stockpiles were expanding. Airfields were being repaired under camouflage. The assumption of a quick victory was evaporating. Operation Downfal was no longer a final push. It was becoming a gamble. a gamble that could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese. The war was supposed to be ending. Instead, it was preparing to reach its most violent phase. And in Washington, the question was beginning to change. It was no longer, how do we invade Japan? It was, is invasion survivable? The casualties that never happened. No historian can state precise numbers with certainty. Projections varied widely. Some American estimates predicted 250,000 total casualties. Others projected numbers approaching or exceeding 1 million, when including wounded. Japanese military and civilian deaths were expected to be dramatically higher, and these were not mere hypotheticals. The model used was Okinawa. Okinawa produced approximately 12,000 American dead and far greater Japanese losses on a much smaller island. Kyushu and Honshu were larger, more populated, and more fortified. The counterfactual remains unresolved. Would Japan have fought to near annihilation, or would surrender have occurred after initial landings? Operation Downfal never tested those variables. Strategic implications. The cancellation of Downfal did more than end a campaign. It reshaped warfare. The atomic bomb demonstrated that strategic objectives, once achievable only through mass invasion, could now be accomplished differently. Military planning after 1945 changed permanently. Large-scale amphibious invasions between industrial powers became less central. Nuclear deterrence replaced conventional attrition as a primary strategic framework. The decision that ended Downfal marked the beginning of a new military era. The geopolitical outcome. The war concluded before the large-scale Soviet occupation of Japan could occur. Unlike Germany, Japan was not divided into occupation zones. American forces oversaw post-war reconstruction without a rival power sharing the homeland. Speed influenced geography. Had Downfal proceeded into 1946, Soviet advances in Asia might have altered the political map significantly. Operation Downfal was not only a military contingency, it was a geopolitical pivot point. Ethical debate. The atomic decision remains debated. Supporters argue it prevented a catastrophic invasion and saved lives overall. Critics argue that the human cost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced moral consequences that cannot be measured purely in numbers. Operation Downfal exists at the center of that debate. Without Downfal's projected casualties, the justification shifts. With them, the strategic logic becomes clearer, the historical reality. What remains undeniable is this. In 1945, the United States fully intended to invade Japan. The plans were operational. The forces were mobilized. The beaches were selected. Japan fully intended to resist. Troops were concentrated. Civilians were mobilized. Airfields were hidden. Ketsgo was real. Two national survival doctrines were on a collision course. The collision never occurred. The meaning, Operation Downfal, represents the edge of conventional warfare. It was a final expression of industrial-scale amphibious assault planning. Its cancellation marked the transition into the nuclear age. The war did not end with soldiers storming the outskirts of Tokyo. It ended with strategic shock and rapid surrender. The beaches of Kyushu remained untouched by invasion, but their absence shaped history. Operation Downfal was the largest battle that never happened, and its shadow explains why the war ended the way it did. By late July 1945, Operation Olympic was no longer just a question of troop strength. It had become a problem of logistics, intelligence, and time. The invasion plan depended on one core assumption: overwhelming material superiority would compensate for resistance. But material superiority only works if it can be delivered, and delivery depended on ships. Operation Olympic required over 2,500 ships, hundreds of thousands of troops in the first wave, continuous reinforcement across weeks, massive ammunition, and fuel throughput. Every shell fired on Kyushu had to cross the Pacific first. Every wounded soldier required evacuation routes. Every tank required fuel deliveries on schedule. Unlike campaigns in Europe, there was no friendly land border behind the front. The Pacific offered no margin for error. If supply faltered, the invasion stalled. If the invasion stalled, Japanese counterattacks would concentrate, and intelligence was beginning to suggest that Japan understood this vulnerability. American codebreakers monitoring Japanese communications detected increased troop transfers southward, rail movements, shipping logs, reinforcement orders. Kyushu was being prioritized. Each new intercept forced revisions to American planning models. What had been considered a manageable defense force was growing into a massed army. Operational planners recalculated landing zones. Air planners reassessed strike capacity. Naval commanders revised risk assessments for transport convoys. The projections kept rising, not gradually, sharply. At Okinawa, suicide aircraft had proven capable of penetrating naval screens. Now intelligence indicated thousands of aircraft were reserved specifically for homeland defense. Many were hidden in dispersed rural airfields. Others were camouflaged in caves. Fuel was scarce, but suicide missions required little training and no return capability. American naval planners conducted probability assessments. Even if 70% of attacking aircraft were intercepted, the remaining 30% could inflict devastating losses. Transports, not battleships, were the primary concern. Losing capital ships damaged prestige. Losing transports destroyed invasions. Autumn typhoons were a recurring risk in the Western Pacific. November landings meant exposure to unpredictable weather systems. Rough seas could delay reinforcements. Cloud cover could reduce air support precision. Storms could scatter landing formations. Meanwhile, Kyushu's mountainous interior created natural artillery observation posts. Japanese defenders could monitor beachheads from elevated positions. American forces would land under surveillance. There would be no surprise factor comparable to Normandy's deception campaigns. The beaches were expected, and they were prepared. Military planners ran casualty absorption simulations. How many wounded could be evacuated per day? How many hospital ships were available? How many replacement troops were trained and ready? Okinawa had already stretched medical logistics to their limits. Downfal would multiply those numbers several times over. If casualty rates exceeded evacuation capacity, morale would degrade rapidly. Invasion success was not simply about capturing ground. It was about sustaining force cohesion under extreme loss. While Operation Olympic preparations intensified, another project was reaching completion. The Manhattan Project had successfully tested a new weapon in July 1945. The existence of that weapon did not automatically cancel Downfal. Early planning assumed both would proceed independently, but timing began to matter. Olympic was scheduled for November. The new weapon was available sooner. For the first time, planners had a theoretical alternative to amphibious invasion, not blockade, not attrition, immediate shock. Until mid-1945, the strategic question had been, how do we ensure invasion success? Now it has become, is invasion the optimal path? Intelligence had altered the risk profile. Logistics had revealed fragility. Weather introduced unpredictability. Civilian mobilization complicated the moral calculus. And casualty projections were climbing with each updated estimate. The invasion plan was still active. Ships continued assembling. Troops continued training. But the certainty behind the operation had weakened. Operation Downfal was no longer inevitable. It was conditional. By early August, the United States faced two operational timelines. One required months of buildup and acceptance of massive casualties. The other promised immediate strategic shock, with unknown long-term consequences. The invasion of Japan was still on the calendar, but for the first time, it was not the only decisive option on the table. The invisible factors, intelligence, logistics, probability, had shifted the balance. The next decision would not be made on a beach. It would be made in a room. By August 1945, Operation Downfal remained officially scheduled. Troop deployments were advancing. Transport fleets were assembling across the Pacific. Operational orders were drafted. But inside Washington, confidence was eroding. The invasion was no longer evaluated as a feasibility question. It was evaluated as a question of acceptable loss. Military planners presented a range of estimates. Some projections suggested 250,000 American casualties across both Olympic and Coronet. Others ran significantly higher. Certain internal estimates warned that losses could exceed those suffered in all previous Pacific campaigns combined. The problem was uncertainty. Japanese troop concentrations on Kyushu had exceeded expectations. Kamikaze reserves were larger than originally believed. Civilian mobilization introduced an unpredictable variable. Models could not stabilize. Each revision forced upward adjustments, and no projection could guarantee rapid collapse after the initial landings. The Battle of Okinawa became the primary comparison. American forces eventually prevailed, but the cost was severe. Suicide aircraft had penetrated naval screens repeatedly. Japanese resistance continued even after organized command structures collapsed. Civilian casualties were extensive. Okinawa was not the main island. It was smaller, less strategically critical, less symbolically central. If that level of resistance occurred, their planners asked, what happens when the homeland itself is threatened? The invasion of Kyushu would not be an island seizure. It would be perceived as existential. The responsibility for the final decision rested with Harry S. Truman. He had assumed office only months earlier, following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. The European War had concluded. The Pacific War remained. Truman was briefed on Operation Downfal scope. He was also briefed on projected casualties. Simultaneously, he was informed of a new weapon successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. The decision was no longer purely military. It was strategic and political. The United States had just emerged from 4 years of global war. Public tolerance for another year of extreme casualties was uncertain. Another factor intensified urgency. The Soviet Union had committed to entering the war against Japan. If the conflict extended into 1946, Soviet forces would advance into Manchuria, potentially influencing post-war arrangements in East Asia. Prolonged invasion timelines increased the probability of divided occupation zones. Speed mattered, not only for military victory, but for geopolitical positioning. Operation Downfal required months. The new weapon offered immediacy. There was no single meeting where the invasion was dramatically canceled. Instead, planning documents gradually shifted language. Downfal remained the default plan, but contingency options gained weight. Some advisors argued blockade and continued conventional bombing might eventually force surrender. Others doubted starvation alone would break Japan's resistance quickly enough. The atomic weapon presented a third path. Its destructive capacity had been demonstrated in testing. Its psychological impact was projected to be overwhelming. Unlike invasion, it required no beachhead. Unlike blockade, it required no prolonged waiting. The question crystallized into comparative outcomes. Option 1, invasion, massive troop deployment, high casualty probability, extended combat duration, potential civilian mass resistance. Option 2, continued bombing and blockade, gradual attrition, uncertain timeline, risk of Soviet territorial expansion. Option 3, atomic deployment, immediate strategic shock, unknown diplomatic consequences, ethical implications unprecedented in scale. The calculus was not theoretical. Olympics' timeline was approaching. Ships were not hypothetical. They were loading. When intelligence confirmed continued Japanese reinforcement of Kyushu, optimism within certain planning circles declined sharply. The invasion would succeed eventually, but the cost curve was steep, and it was rising. Operation Downfal had been conceived as the final blow to a collapsing adversary. By August, it looked increasingly like a prolonged continental-scale battle. The question was no longer how to execute the invasion. It was whether executing it was rational, given available alternatives. Within days, that alternative would be used. Operation Downfal was not formally erased. It remained in contingency planning, but its probability dropped dramatically, not because it was impossible, because something faster had entered the equation. The breaking point had been reached. The next phase would not involve landing craft. It would involve a single aircraft and a single device. On August 6, 1945, a single aircraft altered the trajectory of Operation Downfal. A-B-29 bomber released an atomic device over the city of Hiroshima. The weapon was unlike any used in warfare before. Its destructive radius exceeded conventional bombing. Its psychological effect was expected to exceed even that. At the time of deployment, Operation Olympic remained scheduled for November. Transport ships were still assembling. Troops were still training. But the introduction of the atomic weapon immediately reshaped strategic calculations. The atomic strike was not designed as a battlefield tool. It was not intended to support invasion landings. Its purpose was strategic shock. American leadership sought a rapid surrender without initiating the amphibious assault. The assumption was that unprecedented destruction would demonstrate futility. If Japan surrendered, Operation Downfal would become unnecessary. If Japan refused, invasion planning would continue. The weapon did not automatically cancel Downfal. It was deployed to test whether cancellation was possible. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The sequence was deliberate. The objective was to eliminate doubt about American capability. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched operations in Manchuria. The strategic environment shifted within days. Japan now faced atomic destruction, Soviet entry into the war, continued American blockade, imminent invasion timetable. The window for maneuver narrowed dramatically. Within Tokyo, debate intensified. Some military leaders advocated continued resistance under the Ketsgo doctrine. They argued homeland defense could still inflict unacceptable casualties. Others recognized that atomic weapons changed the equation. The emperor's intervention became decisive. On August 15th, Japan announced its intention to surrender. Formal surrender followed aboard the USS Missouri in September. Operation Downfal was suspended, then effectively abandoned. The logistical machine preparing for Olympic did not vanish instantly. Troops remained staged. Ships remained allocated. Operational files remained archived, but the momentum halted. An invasion fleet that would have dwarfed Normandy never sailed toward Kyushu. The beaches marked in planning documents were never contested. The casualty projections were never tested in reality. Downfall shifted from active operation to historical contingency. The atomic deployments achieved their immediate objective. Japan surrendered before the November invasion date. American casualties projected for Kyushu were avoided. Japanese homeland combat was avoided. But the method introduced a new strategic era. The war ended not through amphibious assault, but through nuclear force. Operation Downfal was not defeated on the battlefield. It was bypassed. The decision was not made in isolation. It was shaped by rising casualty projections, intelligence confirming reinforced offenses, logistical vulnerability of invasion forces, Soviet entry into the Pacific theater, political pressure to conclude the war rapidly. The atomic option provided speed. Speed altered outcomes. Operation Downfal required months of preparation and sacrifice. The atomic strikes required days. The strategic timeline collapsed. The largest invasion in military history had been planned in detail. Its landing beaches are selected. Its divisions are assigned. Its supply routes are calculated. Yet it never occurred because the decision shifted from invasion to shock. The war ended without the beaches of Kyushu becoming a battlefield. Operation Downfal had reached its final stage and was replaced. Operation Downfal was never executed, but it was never imaginary. It existed in shipping manifests, troop assignments, artillery schedules, and casualty models. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trained specifically for Kyushu. Millions of Japanese civilians were mobilized for homeland defense. The invasion could not be avoided because it was impossible. It was avoided because of faster method for surrender first. No historian can state precise numbers with certainty. Projections varied widely. Some American estimates predicted 250,000 total casualties. Others projected numbers approaching or exceeding 1 million, when including wounded. Japanese military and civilian deaths were expected to be dramatically higher. The model used was Okinawa. Okinawa produced approximately 12,000 American dead and far greater Japanese losses on a much smaller island. Kyushu and Honshu were larger, more populated, and more fortified. The counterfactual remains unresolved. Would Japan have fought to near annihilation, or would surrender have occurred after initial landings? Operation Downfal never tested those variables. The cancellation of Downfal did more than end a campaign. It reshaped warfare. The atomic bomb demonstrated that strategic objectives, once achievable only through mass invasion, could now be accomplished differently. Military planning after 1945 changed permanently. Large-scale amphibious invasions between industrial powers became less central. Nuclear deterrence replaced conventional attrition as a primary strategic framework. The decision that ended Downfal marked the beginning of a new military era. The war concluded before the large-scale Soviet occupation of Japan could occur. Unlike Germany, Japan was not divided into occupation zones. American forces oversaw post-war reconstruction without a rival power sharing the homeland. Speed influenced geography. Had Downfal proceeded into 1946, Soviet advances in Asia might have altered the political map significantly. Operation Downfal was not only a military contingency, it was a geopolitical pivot point. The atomic decision remains debated. Supporters argue it prevented a catastrophic invasion and saved lives overall. Critics argue that the human cost in Hiroshima and Nagasaki introduced moral consequences that cannot be measured purely in numbers. Operation Downfal exists at the center of that debate. Without Downfal's projected casualties, the justification shifts. With them, the decision appears different. The invasion plan frames the atomic choice. Remove Downfal and the narrative changes. Include it and the strategic logic becomes clearer. What remains undeniable is this. In 1945, the United States fully intended to invade Japan. The plans were operational. The forces were mobilized. The beaches were selected. Japan fully intended to resist. Troops were concentrated. Civilians were mobilized. Airfields were hidden. Ketsgo was real. Two national survival doctrines were on a collision course. The collision never occurred. Operation Downfal represents the edge of conventional warfare. It was a final expression of industrial-scale amphibious assault planning. Its cancellation marked the transition into the nuclear age. The war did not end with soldiers storming the outskirts of Tokyo. It ended with strategic shock and rapid surrender. The beaches of Kyushu remained untouched by invasion, but their absence shaped history. Operation Downfal was the largest battle that never happened, and its shadow explains why the war ended the way it did.